Well, praise the Lord for the work that's going on in India and other places around the world. Um, it's not quite been a month since we switched um, this, whatever it is, our website host. And in a month, there are 130 countries that are connecting with the website, connected with this message. And language-wise, we're reaching with the languages that we provided would cover half of the population of the earth if everyone chose to listen. I know they don't, but I mean, we're halfway there with covering planet Earth with every available language possible. And 130 countries is a lot of countries. Shall we begin with a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this Sabbath. We ask that your Holy Spirit would bless our time that we study here this afternoon and better awaken us and prepare us for the times that we're entering into. We ask continued blessing upon the work that's going on around planet Earth, a work that we are not necessarily familiar with, but that we're holding up in prayer and foremost in our hearts and minds. We ask a blessing upon whatever endeavors your people are doing on planet Earth. And we ask for your presence at this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I'm in the middle of grappling with two articles, pretty much done, but they're still not fully edited. The Panium number 19 and Panium number 20. And I'm going to read through those. And instead of sending out any slides in advance, when I get to points in these readings where it seems appropriate to do an illustration, I'm going to do it by hand right then and there, and then I'll save them, and Jeremy can access them, and anyone that's reposting this, such as herself or Jeremy, whoever, will have a saved version. But I'm going to start from scratch if we get to that point. Um, I looked over my notes, and towards the end of the second article, my notes were these two articles, number 19 and 20. Towards the end of the number 20, which I can't even be sure that we'll get to the end of number 20 today until we start down this road, because I'm going to try to explain some of these things that are in these articles that may seem a little bit confusing as we go. So I don't know how much energy I'll have or how much patience you'll have to listen to all of this. But at the end of number 20, there's a perfect segue for something. And I told it briefly to Steve a couple days ago or a day ago. And this morning, he let me know that it was interesting to him as it had been to me. So I don't really have the appropriate segue into this discussion, but I think I'm going to throw it out there right from the start. Um, maybe not. Maybe not. Let's just see how it goes. Um, I guess at minimum, I've locked myself into the basic prophetic applications that were employed over 30 years ago in 1996 when the Time of the End magazine was published. And I'm meaning this is a really significant point for me. Um, I'm the one that put together the Time of the End magazine. It was a magazine that was created by 11 articles that had been published one a month over 1995, and then at the end of 1995 we took those articles and turned them into one magazine. So I was the one that was selected the scriptures and the spirit of prophecy and the current events that went in that magazine. And now, 30 years later, 30 years after 1996, when we go back to that magazine, Time Then magazine, the the passages from the secular news reporters of the period of 1989, they were saying things back in that history that I was using to prove who the king of the north was and who the king of the south was and who the glorious land was. But those passages that I was selecting to make that point were also telling a story about the Ukraine, that even though I was using those passages, I never seen any reference to the Ukraine. I mean, obviously I read it, but I mean, it just didn't mean anything to me. And now, when we go back into the Time of the End magazine, we see the difficulties that may exist in the Ukrainian war when Putin wins, but then loses. He comes to his demise when he attempts to sacrifice at the temple. That the key to understanding that was right there in the Time of the End magazine that was written 30 years ago. And I'm saying 30 years because 30 is a symbol of the priesthood. And I'm also saying 30 years ago because in 1996, the message was formalized. And 30 years later, now we have the responsibility of formalizing the message of the Midnight Cry. So there's all kinds of prophetic connections with what I'm saying here in kind of a casual way in this article. 30 years later, and the Lord has revealed that another prophetic message is to be formalized, as was the Millerite message formalized in 1831. In the Omega history of these 30 years, the message to be formalized is represented as a correction of a previous message of Islam, as represented by Josiah Litch, and also a corrected message of the closed door, as represented by Samuel Snow, which is the symbol of the parable of the 10 virgins. A message of Islam accompanied with a warning of the progressive closing doors of probation as Christ finishes his work of judgment will be proclaimed. The message is twofold, possessing an internal and external line, which in turn represents the first two steps of the three-step testing process that always occurs when a prophecy is unsealed, as was the revelation of Jesus Christ on December 31st, 2023. The Time of the End magazine contains the basic overview of the future for America as represented in the last 6 verses of Daniel 11, which were unsealed at the time of the end in 1989. The magazine has been in the public record for 30 years, and no one saw that a main theme of the magazine was the religious struggle between communism and the churches under the influence of Catholicism. That religious battle from the period of 1989 explains the context of the religious demise of Putin as represented by Ptolemy and Uzziah in the rebellion they both manifested at the temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem was Uzziah's temple, not Ptolemy's temple. Both Putin and Zelensky desecrate the same temple in 2 different ways, one as an Egyptian and one as a Jew. The church that was struggling against the king of the South in 1989 was the Catholic Church, and why not? Atheism of France delivered the deadly wound to the king of the North in 1798, so why wouldn't the papacy retaliate against atheism's long drawn-out persecution of the Catholic Church, especially in the Ukraine? More significant is that this clear testimony about the Ukraine came from a publication in 1996 that was citing the secular historians about the history of 1989. Now that the Lord is unsealing the hidden history of verse 40, he has pointed to the struggle between 2 Orthodox churches to provide the prophetic and historical context of the Battle of Raphia and its aftermath, and he already included the necessary insights in the Time of the End magazine that was published 30 years ago. The demise of Napoleon illustrates the progressive demise of Lenin, Stalin, and the system of the Soviet Union. When the prophetic Southern Kingdom moved its capital to Russia, there were 2 major revolutions in 1917. The first is what is called the Russian Revolution, when the Tsar was overthrown, and then in the very same year, the Bolshevik Revolution followed, which led to the Civil War of 1917 until 1922. In 1922, the Soviet Union was formed. The beginning of Russia as the spiritual king of the South represented a two-step revolution that led to civil war, then to the formation of a confederacy of countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union was also two steps, beginning with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, which led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. As the last ruler of Russia, the king of the South, Vladimir Putin was typified by the first Russian ruler by the name of Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir means a great leader, and Putin means the path. Lenin means a great river, but Vladimir Lenin chose the name of Lenin to hide his real name, which was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Ilyich means son of Elijah, and Ulyanov means youthful son of Elijah. Vladimir Lenin's original name is an emphasis upon Elijah and his son. I mean, where do you get that from? Okay. The great Russian leader on the path in the history represented by the Battle of Raphia in 2017 BC was typified by the first leader of Russia, who, as Vladimir Lenin, was the great leader of the mighty river, but who hid his name. A name is a symbol of character, and for Vladimir to hide his two names represents a character that chose a great river of political thought over a character represented by Elijah, which means God is Jehovah. The root of atheism is the denial of God, and atheism is a prime characteristic of the King of the South. The second and third given name of Lenin emphasize Elijah and his son, and the end of Russia as the king of the South is represented by Ptolemy IV, who was victorious at the Battle of Raphia. But when Antiochus returned in 200 BC at the Battle of Panium, Ptolemy's 5-year-old son was then ruling. Lenin's two original names identify Elijah and his son and align with Ptolemy and his son. Elijah and the message to his children occur in the latter days, which is what the Battle of Raphia and Panium also represent. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come to smite the earth with a curse. Malachi 4, 5, and 6. One manifestation of the work of Elijah that can be understood by turning the hearts of the fathers to the children and the vice versa is looking at the first ruler of Russia, Vladimir Lenin, and aligning it with the last ruler of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and comparing them prophetically, because Jesus always illustrates the end with the beginning. The testimony of Uzziah and Ptolemy align in verse 11 of Daniel 11. And Uzziah lived for 11 years after his rebellion with leprosy, whereas Ptolemy ruled for a total of 17 years, which is the same number of years between the battle of verse 11 and verse 15. The 250-year prophecy that began in 457 ended in 207 BC in the middle of those two battles, 10 years after Raphia and 7 years before Panium. Ptolemy IV's reign began in 2013 BC, and he died in 2004 BC. So the 17 years of Ptolemy are not the same line as the 17 years from Raphia to Panium. Nor are they the same 17 years that are represented by the conclusion of the 250-year prophecy beginning with Nero in 64 and ending in 313. From 313 to the first Sunday law in 321 is 8 years, and 9 years later in 330, Constantine divided the kingdom into east and west. In the very year Putin and Russia In the very near future, Putin and Russia will defeat Ukraine, and the footsteps of Ptolemy and Uzziah will begin to repeat in the history represented by verse 12. The two biblical witnesses place the final crisis for Putin in a religious context. Their rebellion was manifested at the temple in Jerusalem, thus identifying Uzziah's temple and religion as the point of prophetic reference. Zelensky, which means green, is the puppet of the globalist bureaucrats of the European Union and the United Nations, whose globalist agenda is aptly represented by the green political movement that worships Mother Earth. It is fitting that Zelensky was an actor, for he is clearly a proxy of other powers, and his name, meaning green, identifies the political philosophy that guides his movements on the chessboard of human history. Checkmate is right around the corner for Zelensky. In this final history, the rebellion of Uzziah and Ptolemy will once again be acted out. But Ptolemy, Putin, died 4 years before the Battle of Panium, and the last ruler of the South is represented by a 5-year-old child who is being handled by a series of corrupt and incompetent regents. Ptolemy V was only about 5 or 6 years old when he ascended the throne in 204 BC after his father's mysterious death, and the Ptolemaic kingdom was paralyzed by a series of incompetent or corrupt regencies during his reign. The initial regency was from 204 to 202 BC after Ptolemy IV's death was concealed, and his mother Arsinoe III murdered the court's favorite Sasabius, a longtime minister under Ptolemy IV, and Agathocles, the brother of Ptolemy IV's mistress, Agathoclea, declared themselves regents. They forged or presented a will, making them guardians, placed the young ruler under the care of Agathoclea and her family, and purged potential rivals. Sasabius handled much of the early administration. A shift occurred around 202 BC when Agathocles became the dominant regent, but was widely hated for debauchery and mismanagement. A popular uprising in Alexandria led to his brutal lynching by a mob, with the boy king nominally approving. Subsequent regents were Tlepolemus, the governor of Pelusium, and Aristomenes. By the time of the Battle of Panium in 200 BC, the kingdom was under this rotating series of regents and court advisors. At the Battle of Panium, the Ptolemaic forces were led in the field by General Scopas of Aetolia, a mercenary commander appointed under the regency, not by Ptolemy V himself. The young king had no real control. The decisions, military strategies, the kingdom's overall weakness stemmed from the regent's paralysis, internal revolts like the native Egyptian uprisings, and court intrigue. This instability allowed Antiochus III the Great to decisively defeat Scopas at Panium, seizing whole Syria, including Judea, permanently from the Ptolemaic control. Ptolemy of the Battle of Raphia represents a power that is no longer ruling at the Battle of Panium. Historians discuss the probability that Ptolemy IV's death was by poisoning, which is also part of the historical speculation concerning Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, as well as the Queen of the South, Cleopatra. Putin prevails in the Ukrainian war, but then his demise begins with his desire to implement the controlling relationship that the Soviet Union formerly had with the Ukrainian church, which when removed in 1989 was the symbol of the victory of religious victory, the symbol of the victory of the war of the King of the North over the King of the South. Told you I still need some copy editing there, okay? The victory of, I'm going to take this out, of the King of the South over the King of the North. The Ukraine is the cradle of Eastern Slavic Orthodoxy. The baptism of Vladimir the Great took place in 988 in Kiev. Moscow later claimed the title Third Rome after Constantinople fell, positioning itself as the rightful heir and spiritual guardian of all Russian lands, including the Ukraine as its canonical territory. The Moscow Patriarchate has always viewed Ukraine as spiritually inseparable from Russia, with the motto of one people, one faith, which is a phrase Putin himself has repeatedly used. Ukraine, especially since 2014/2022, increasingly sees Moscow's oversight as colonial and imperial domination rather than true spiritual motherhood. As of February 2026, this month, there are two competing Orthodox structures, one within the Ukraine. One is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which since 2019 has been independent from Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople. In Kiev, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is considered as the truly national church. Reader beware, reader beware, reader beware. This is the point you got to get, okay? The Orthodox Church of Ukraine is a different church than the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine is a different church than the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is connected with Russia's Orthodox Church, and for this reason, Zelensky has been attacking it. The Vatican opposes the attacks of Zelensky that are already underway, but Putin's attempts follow the Battle of Raphia and is yet future. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church was historically linked to the Moscow body. It declared full autonomy in May 2022 from the Russian body because of the invasion. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church in 2022 claimed full autonomy from its Russian connection, but Ukrainian state investigators have repeatedly argued it remains canonically and legally affiliated with Moscow. Ukraine passed a law in August 2024, signed by Zelensky, banning any religious body tied to the Russian Orthodox Church, the aggressor state. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been ordered to fully sever ties with court-ordered dissolution of its Kiev metropolis. As of late 2025 and early 2026, there are ongoing raids, parish transfers to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, over 1,300 since 2022, court cases, and UN experts, if there is such a thing, warning of religious freedom concerns regarding the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Vatican has publicly opposed any forced dissolution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Russia and Putin framed this as an outright persecution of canonical orthodoxy and have made protection of the Russian Orthodox churches an explicit demand at any peace negotiations. Russia propaganda consistently ties the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian state attacks upon it as Nazism, as part of their denazification justification. Putin will presumptuously enter the temple and claim full spiritual dominion over the Ukrainian Orthodoxy in an attempt to resubordinate the entire Ukrainian church structure under Moscow, demanding recognition as the rightful spiritual head of the Russian Orthodox world. This is the exact parallel to Ptolemy entering the most holy place, while Uzziah is Zelensky seeking to burn incense. Ptolemy's rebellion was in the most holy place, and Uzziah's was in the holy place. A southern king flushed with the victory of the borderline, ending the proxy power of Nazism, and then overstepping into the place that belongs only into the realm of religion. Then will come a sudden providential humbling, and Putin will disappear from the scene as Ptolemy IV died in 2004 BC. After the power vacuum of weak successors phase, the northern king returns with greater force and prevails at the modern Panium in verse 15. 17. 17 years occur 3 times in the history where the battles of Raphia and Panium merge together, line upon line. The 17 years from the Edict of Milan, where the eastern and western thrones of the empire were brought together through marriage until the kingdom was divided and divorced in 330. The 17 years beginning and ending are waymarks of 2 other related prophetic periods. What I'm trying to say here now, for those of you that are listening, is that these periods of 17 years are not going to be found in some prediction by one of the prophets. Isaiah is not going to say, there is 17 years between the battle of Raphia and the battle of Panium. But this 17-year period can be deduced by history, but the history that it can be deduced with is prophetic history in the sense, and I'm going to show this to you now if you haven't already recognized it, that the beginning of the 17-year period and the ending of the 17-year period are waymarks of other prophetic passages. And therefore, the beginning and ending of these 17-year periods, they may not have the word 17 specifically expressed in any verse in the Bible, but they're expressed between the ending of one prophecy and the beginning of the other. They're just sitting there for anyone that uses the methodology of line upon line to see. The 17 years beginning and ending are waymarks of 2 other related prophetic periods. Beginning with Nero, or Nero, however you pronounce that, in the year 64, a period of persecution is marked that ended in the history of Constantine the Great. The transition from Nero's period of persecution unto the compromise represented by Constantine identifies the transition from the Church of Smyrna unto the Church of Pergamos. 313 and the Edict of Milan identify the end of the Church of Smyrna, and the end of the 17-year period is the year 330. Which was the fulfillment of the 360-year prophecy of Daniel 11:12. And Daniel 11:12 is there for you to see. And what I'm saying is Nero, he's marking the beginning of Smyrna, the end of Ephesus. Ephesus begins as a white horse and carries the gospel to the world, but it loses its first love. And then the Church of Smyrna, the church of persecution, begins, and the figure in Roman history that marks the beginning of this persecution is Nero. So he's the end of Ephesus, the beginning of Smyrna, and 250 years later takes you to the end of Smyrna and the beginning of Pergamos. So I'm saying when you get to the end of Smyrna and the beginning of Pergamos, you're at the Edict of Milan in the year 313, and 17 years later takes you to the year 330, which is when the kingdom is divided, but it's also the fulfillment of the 360th year of the prophecy of a time of Daniel 11:24. So the beginning of that 17-year period and the ending of that 17-year period are marked by two other prophecies. The 17 years from 313 and the Edict of Milan begins with the fulfillment of a prophecy and ends at the fulfillment of another prophecy. The first prophetic fulfillment, which marks the beginning, identifies the transition from the church of Smyrna unto the church of Pergamos. And the prophecy that marks the end of those 17 years identifies the division of Rome into Eastern and Western Rome. The 17 years is identified by prophetic history, not by any specific 17-year prophecy. The alpha of the division of the second church from the third church aligned with the division of the empire into East and West at the fulfillment of the time prophecy of 360 years. Those two prophecies that established a period of 17 years would need to be established upon the witness of two or three if 17 were actually a valid symbol. Those witnesses exist in another 250-year period, which began in 457 BC. On that date, the 2300 prophecy of Daniel 8:14 began. 457 is a starting point, and it's also an ending part. It's the third of three decrees, but that's not my point. The starting point of Nero was also the ending of Ephesus. Okay, so extended 250 years into the future brings you to 207 BC, which is the history between the battles of Raphia and Panium. The Battle of Raphia and Panium cannot be separated, for they are both engaged in by Antiochus the Great. In other words, that history is a prophetic fulfillment. Even if it's a period of time and the 250 years end in the middle of that period of time, Raphia and Panium are a waymark unto themselves. And that 250-year period is coming right into that waymark. Okay? From the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC until the Battle of Panium in 200 BC is 17 years. The 2300-year prophecy identifies a change of dispensation at the beginning when the third decree restored Judah's national sovereignty, and then at the end when Christ moved from the holy place to the most holy place, there was a change of dispensation, both at the beginning and the ending. 207 represents the change of dispensation of Egyptian rule over Judea under the Seleucid dispensation of rule over the glorious land. The dispensation of Seleucid control over the glorious land produced the revolts of the Maccabees in 167 BC. Please notice this. This isn't something that we have discussed. Maybe you know this. It's not anything that's been discussed on these Zoom meetings that I remember. One of the things that's happening in the story of Raphia to Panium is that Judah, which is the literal glorious land, okay, Judah has been under the dominance of Egypt. But once the Seleucid Empire defeats Egypt at the Battle of Panium, now Judah, the glorious land, is under the influence, the control of the Seleucid Empire. And it's from the activities of the Seleucids controlling the glorious land that spurs the Maccabees into revolting against the rulership of the Seleucid Empire as represented by the Antiochuses and the other Seleucid leaders. The point is, from Raphia to Panium, you're watching a transition of powers that are ruling over Judea. And when you get to verse 16, Rome's going to take control of Judea. So one of the storylines in this history. It's about the glorious land. Of course, the story of the glorious land, the literal glorious land, is a story of the United States. And I intend to show you how the Maccabees are the story of the United States. But if you're going to understand the story of the United States as represented by the Maccabees, then you have to understand that the Maccabees revolution was to throw off the restraints of the Seleucid Empire, not the Egyptian Empire, not the Roman Empire, but the Seleucid Empire, which at that time in relation to them was the king of the north. So that's part of this structural illustration in these prophecies. Continuing on. The narrow period of 250 years ends with the history of Constantine the Great, and the 250 years that conclude between the two battles is the history of Antiochus the Great. At the Battle of Raphia, Ptolemy IV defeated Antiochus the Great, and Ptolemy reigned for 17 years. Both 250-year periods contain a distinct 17-year period. Both end in the history of a ruler who is known as the Great. Both 250-year periods begin at an established prophetic waymark, and they both end at an established prophetic waymark. United States began on July 4, 1776, and 250 years later brings you to July 4th, 2026, when Donald Trump, who is known as the one seeking to make America great, is going to celebrate those 250 years. 2026, like unto the 250 years from 457 BC, concludes in the middle of the history of the modern battles of Raphia and Panium, known as the Ukrainian and Third World War. I'm calling Panium the Third World War, and the Ukrainian War is Raphia. The reign of the Southern King, the period of the First Sunday Law, and the period of the Battle of Raphia to Panium provide 3 periods of 17 years that are all connected with the same prophetic history. 3 250-year periods all arrive together in the same prophetic histories. The 3 periods of 250 years establish 3 lines of prophetic truth with history associated with Donald Trump, represented either as Constantine the Great or Antiochus the Great. The 3 lines of 250 years provide a different but complementary illustration of the latter days. Lero's line identifies the 17-year history of compromise that perfectly speaks to the prophetic characteristics of the formation of the image of the beast. The Lord has shown me clearly that the image of the beast will be formed before probation closes, for it is to be the great test for the people of God, by which their eternal destiny will be decided. Your position is such a jumble of inconsistencies that but few will be deceived. In Revelation 13, this subject is plainly presented. Revelation 13, 11 through 17 quoted. This is the test that the people of God must have before they are sealed. All who prove their loyalty to God by observing his law and refusing to accept a spurious Sabbath will rank under the banner of the Lord God Jehovah and will receive the seal of the living God. Those who yield the truth of heavenly origin and accept the Sunday Sabbath will receive the mark of the beast. The image of the beast is the combination of church and state, with the church in control of the relationship. The compromise of Constantine in attempting to bring paganism together with Christianity is the classic example of the compromise of the latter days. In the movements now in progress in the United States to secure for the institutions and usages of the church the support of the state, Protestants are following in the steps of papacy. More, they are opening the door for the papacy to regain in Protestant America the supremacy which she has lost in the old world. And that which gives greater significance to this movement is the fact that the principal object contemplated is the enforcement of Sunday observance, a custom which originated with Rome and which she claims as the sign of her authority. It is the spirit of the papacy, the spirit of conformity to worldly customs, the veneration of human traditions above the commandments of God that is permeating the Protestant churches and leading them to do the same work of Sunday exaltation which the papacy has done before them. If the reader would understand the agencies to be employed in the soon coming contest, he has but to trace the record of the means which Rome employed for the same objects in the past. If he would know how papists and Protestants united will deal with those who reject their dogmas, let him see the spirit which Rome manifested towards the Sabbath and its defenders. Royal edicts, that's the Edict of Milan. Royal edicts, general councils, and church ordinances sustained by secular power were the steps. It's a step-by-step process. Setting up of the image of the beast is a process. Were the steps by which the pagan festival attained its position of honor in the Christian world. The first public measure enforcing Sunday observance was the law enacted by Constantine, AD 321. This edict required townspeople to rest on the venerable day of the sun, but permitted countrymen to continue their agricultural pursuits. Though virtually a heathen statute, it was enforced by the emperor after his nominal acceptance of Christianity, the Great Controversy 574. There's something here, it's not really germane to the direction that I'm going in this article, but I'm going to throw it in here. This 17-year period that begins with the Edict of Milan, and then in 321, the first Sunday law, and then 330, the kingdom divided. When you're talking about 321 and the first Sunday law, one of the characteristics, or the characteristic here that Sister White was identifying, is that even though it was a Sunday law, it still allowed for agricultural pursuits, okay? And recently, my son was reading one of A.T. Jones' big books, The Two Republics, hundreds of pages. And in The Two Republics by A.T. Jones, you can check this out. A.T. Jones, who's commenting on the history of the Sunday law crisis in the United States in the 1880s, he's given an overview of all that. And he identifies that the Sunday laws of the 1880s, they took place in a handful of southern states, but the only one that A.T. Jones really focuses on is my home state. It's not my home state, but it's where I live. It's Arkansas. I'm actually born and raised in a state called California, which no one wants to admit any longer after what's happened to California, but that's the truth of the matter. Now we live in Arkansas, and in Jones's commentary on the Sunday law crisis from the 1880s, which Sister White was just speaking about, that the movements in that time period she was referring to towards Sunday legislation, Jones is commenting on, and he only focuses on Arkansas. And although there were other southern states that were passing Sunday laws in that time period, the thing that Jones points out that made the Arkansas Sunday law different than the other Sunday laws were that it allowed for to do agriculture on Sunday as long as the gardening you were doing was just to sustain yourself. You couldn't do any gardening if you were going to sell the produce, but that was the difference with the Sunday law in Arkansas rather than the other states that were passing Sunday laws in that history. And I just find it curious that the very first Sunday law in 321, it has this agricultural qualification as well. And what happened here in Arkansas is that there was a Sabbath keeper that went out and harvested his potatoes on Sunday, and his neighbors were spying on him and seeing that he was doing it, and they went and they interacted with him, telling him, why he's breaking the law, whatever. And he wouldn't back down. The Adventists wouldn't back down from his pursuits and ends up in court and in jail. And the worst fulfillment of the Sunday laws in that time period took place in Arkansas. There was actually people that, when their husbands were taken to prison, some of their families died from starvation, and some of them that were taken into prison died in prison just from the hard times in prison. So all I'm saying is, here we are in Arkansas, and Arkansas, according to T. Jones, is the classic example of the Sunday law crisis that he was speaking to in that history. Okay. So moving on, we'll come back to this perhaps in a moment, but we got to get through this article. The progression of compromise that led to and will again lead to the Sunday law is represented with the 17-year period from 313 to 330, with the first Sunday law, 321, as the midpoint of that history. At the beginning was the marriage of the East and West, and at the end was the divorce of East and West. The first Sunday law in the middle way mark representing rebellion, just as the 13th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, when preceded by the first and followed by the 22nd and last letter of the alphabet, makes up the Hebrew word truth. Marriage at the beginning and divorce at the end identifies the alpha letter in agreement with the omega letter. The period of 250 years that began with Nero has a signature of Christ, and it speaks to the subject of present truth in the last days. And of course, the year 321 being the middle way mark, it's a symbol of rebellion. Is the first Sunday law a symbol of rebellion? Yes. The 250 years that begins with 457 BC is emphasizing the statecraft represented by Antiochus the Great as he stands within the 17-year period from Raphia and Panium, from Raphia to Panium. We understand it as statecraft, for in 457, a prophecy of 2,300 years also began. The 2,300 years is the internal line of prophecy that speaks to God's work of redemption, which aligns with a symbol of churchcraft. Unlike the 250-year period that began with Nero, the period that begins in 457 BC is addressing the political role of the last president who is seeking to make America and the world great as he promotes the Catholic concept of the golden age of 1,000 years of peace. The 250 years of the United States, who is the earth beast of Revelation 13, identifies the conclusion of the sixth kingdom of Bible prophecy that ends where it began, in the midst of a war. The victors of history define the record of history that is preserved. To the globalist dragon-powered Democrats, the globalist dragon-powered Democrats view the current anarchy, I'm going to change that while I'm here, view the current anarchy as a revolution. And they all talk and no action. The Republicans view this current history as civil war or civil unrest. The Democrats, the representatives of the dragon of Bible prophecy, and the Republicans are representative of apostate Protestants. Or in terms of John in Revelation 16, they are the false prophet. The United States began in a war of revolution, and it ends with the Democrats pushing a war of revolution against the Republicans, who see the same war as a civil war. Trump, as the last Republican president, possesses the prophetic attributes of the first Republican president, who arrived in the external history of the Civil War, which was also the internal history of Isaiah's prophecy of chapter 7, verse 8, that ended in 1863, the very year of the Emancipation Proclamation. The distinctions between the two parties is a primary and foundational prophetic principle. It began with Cain and Abel, who in the time of Christ were represented by the Sadducees and Pharisees, two classes of Cain who were to murder one Abel. The Pharisees and Sadducees represents those who agreed to crucify their Messiah for different reasons, but agreement just the same. The Pharisees professed to uphold the law, but didn't, as do the Republicans. The Pharisees professed to uphold the original divine law, but interpreted the law through their own bigoted logic. The original law for the Pharisees is the Constitution for the Republicans, the very Constitution they could claim to support, but don't. The Sadducees rejected the power of God, and though a smaller sect than the Pharisees, the Sadducees controlled the religious and political landscape of Judea in the time of Christ. The Democrats are a smaller sect than the Republicans, so small they must cheat to stay in power, but stay in power they do. For their opponents, who profess to uphold equal justice for all, do nothing to enforce the principles of the law they profess to uphold. There is nothing new under the sun, and the two political parties in the United States are as much a part of the prophetic landscape as were the Pharisees and Sadducees. There are, of course, many other parallels along this prophetic line, but it is only when you see the prophetic relationship of the two unholy powers who, though adversaries, become united against holiness, that you see that when Ptolemy and Uzziah, that you then see Ptolemy and Uzziah in the proper light, that you then see. Sorry. It's only when you see this adversarial relationship between the Pharisees, then in coming into unity against the holy power, that you can recognize the relationship between Ptolemy and Uzziah that I'm trying to show you here. Both southern kings attempted to sacrifice at the same temple, but Ptolemy from Egypt represents a dragon power, the Democrats. Uzziah, as king of Judea, is the leader of the glorious land, who is apostate Protestantism, or the false prophet, the Republicans. The history of the two biblical southern kings aligns with the Ukrainian war. So the temple under discussion is the temple that both Russia and the Catholic proxy power of the Ukraine have been in a struggle over since the end of World War II. The relation of the dragon and the false prophet is classically represented at Mount Carmel. At the Mount, Ahab represented the dragon, and Jezebel's prophets of Baal and Asherah represented the false prophet who stood against Elijah. The beast that is Jezebel was still behind the scenes in Samaria. The dragon, united with the false prophet, was also represented by pagan Rome and the Jews' unification at the cross, and will be the unification of the Democrats and the Republicans at the Sunday law. The elements of a united power are represented by the Democrats and Republicans within the Republican horn of the earth beast. Those two unholy political powers are represented by Cain, and the line of Abel also possesses a twofold division. Abel's line, which in relation to Cain's external line, is the internal line and is represented by two classes of virgins. The progression of the Protestant horn of the earth beast that is the United States is represented by a series of religious purgings, beginning with the Church of Sardis in 1798, when the United States became the sixth kingdom of Bible prophecy. Sardis was a church who had a name claiming that it lived, but it was dead. By 1798, the Protestant sects that had broken away from the papal church were already returning to Rome. Christians were first named Christians in Antioch. It was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. The name was given them because Christ was the main theme of their preaching, their teaching, and their conversation. Continually, they were recounting the incidents that had occurred during the days of his earthly ministry, when his disciples were blessed with his personal presence. Untiringly, they dwelt upon his teachings and his miracles of healing. With quivering lips and tearful eyes, they spoke of his agony in the garden, his betrayal, trial, and execution, the forbearance and humility with which he endured the contumely and tortured imposed upon him by his enemies, and the godlike piety with which he prayed for those who persecuted him. His resurrection, his ascension, and his work in heaven as the mediator for fallen man were topics on which they rejoiced to dwell. Well might the heathen call them Christians, since they preached Christ and addressed their prayers to God through him. It was God who gave them the name of Christian. This is a royal name given to all who join themselves to Christ. It was of this name that James wrote later, "Do not rich men oppress you and draw you before the judgment seats? Do not they blaspheme that worthy name by which you are called?" James 2, 6 and 7. And Peter declared, "If any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. If you be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you." Acts of the Apostles 1:57. The church of Ephesus was given the name of Christian, which led to the persecuted church of Smyrna that was followed by the church of compromise in the history of Pergamos. When the papacy took the throne, a separation identified God's true church as the church in the wilderness. The Roman church was Thyatira. At the ending of the wilderness of the 1260 years, the church of the church of Protestantism arose. And from that point onward, the Protestant horn is represented by a divine series of tests and purges. Protestantism began when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Thesis upon the door in 1517, and 23 years later, in 1540, the Jesuit order began. In 2013, the 95th and final presentation of Habakkuk's tables was nailed to the door, and on March 13, 2013, the first Jesuit pope was inaugurated. Martin Luther was excommunicated in that very history by Pope Leo. Go figure. In 1798, the Church of Sardis claimed to hold to the name of Protestant, but by returning to Rome, they were already failing to uphold their name. When Millerite Adventism took the torch of Protestantism in 1844, they represented a rebuke against Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, a nation who were blood relatives to the tribe of Judah, where God had placed his temple. Jeroboam set up a counterfeit based upon the religion that represented his nation's former bondage. He repeated Aaron's foundational rebellion of erecting an image of the beast with all the prophetic significance associated with the story. But at his dedication service, Millerite Adventism rebuked his unwillingness to continue to direct true worship to the sanctuary where God lives. But Millerite Adventism chose to return to Rome and took up the very doctrinal arguments of those who had just been exposed as false prophets through their rejection of Miller's message as the theological masters. Millerite Adventism, as with the disobedient prophet, chose their own path instead of following God's direction. The path that is chosen by the foolish and all the tests and purges of the wise and foolish virgins from the Protestant Reformation onward in prophetic history is the path which returns to the worship of the land that you were delivered from. And as they say, all roads lead to Rome. All roads except Jeremiah's old paths. The Protestant Reformation had been typified by Moses' return to Egypt in order to lead God's people into the promised land. Once out of the land of captivity, God purposed to give his chosen people his law. In the line of Moses and the Protestant Reformation, rebellion was manifested immediately after the deliverance. God tested Sardis, a people who claimed to have a living name but were dead by the time of the message of William Miller. Two purgings took place in 1844. The first was the purge of the Church of Sardis, who had claimed to be Protestants but were proven to be dead, And then the Millerites were purged in the same year in fulfillment of the parable of the 10 virgins. The Democrats and Republicans represent two political classes that together make up the Republican horn on the earth beast of Revelation 13. The wise and foolish virgins are two religious classes that together make up the Protestant horn on the earth beast. The wise virgins possess the first name given at Antioch. The wise virgins are Christians, but they're also Philadelphians who have the promise of receiving a name. Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. And I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which cometh down out of heaven from my God. And I will write upon him my new name. Revelation 3:12. The first time God named his people Christian was at Antioch. And the history where the Laodicean movement of the 144,000 changes into the Philadelphian movement of the 144,000 is in the history of Antiochus the Great, who is represented at the end of the 250-year period between the battles of Raphia and Panium. Number 20. The pioneer application of the history which fulfilled verses 10 through 16 identified the Rome who established the vision arrived in the year 200 BC, the same year as the Battle of Panium. And I am suggesting that in 2025, Rome arrived and established the vision with the inauguration of Trump and Pope Leo. 2025 represents the only time a pope and a president were inaugurated in the same year. The beast and its image lifted up for all who are willing to see in 2025. Unlike the pioneers, I'm applying the sequence of the verses instead of the history that initially fulfilled the verses. I agree with the history, but I'm drawing upon a sequence within the verses as the framework for the history, as opposed to using the history to define the framework of the verses. I contend that the two approaches are both accurate. The revolution of the Maccabees. I apply the line of the Maccabees in a similar fashion. The Maccabean revolt in 167 BC was well after the Battle of Panium in 200 BC and well before Pompey captured Jerusalem in 63 BC, yet the line which begins at verse 16 with General Pompey's conquering of Jerusalem in 63 BC and continues through to Tiberius, who reigned when Jesus was crucified. The cross and Tiberius is represented in verse 22 of chapter 11. So if you're beginning, what I'm saying is if you're beginning with Pompey conquering Judah and Jerusalem in verse 16 in 63 BC, that verse 16 continues on to verse 22. And in verse 22, you have Tiberius Caesar and Christ, both in verse 22. And I'm saying the history represented from verse 16 to verse 22 is one line of prophecy. I'm going to show you why it's one line of prophecy, verse 22 being the ending and verse 16 being the beginning. So, General Pompey conquering Jerusalem in 63 BC in verse 16, and then the cross in 31 AD in verse 22 represents a line of prophecy that begins at a symbol of the Sunday law and ends with a symbol of the Sunday law. Verse 23 is a break in the passage, thus marking verse 22 as the end of the prophetic line that began in verse 16. Accompanied with the distinct ending of the line in verse 22, the fact that verse 22 is a symbol of the same waymark represented in verse 16 provides another answer that verse 16 to 22 represent a distinct prophetic line. Okay, I don't want to lose the flow of thought here, but I do want to show you something. This is simple. What I'm saying is this here, this is verse 22. This is verse 16. And this is the cross. And this is Pompey down here in verse 16, conquering Judea for the first time. It's the verse that typifies verse 41. This is verse 16 and verse 41, which is both the Sunday law. But the cross down here at the end is also typifying the Sunday law. So this line has the same beginning and ending, although they are different. Okay, it has a Sunday law typified at the beginning, the Sunday law typified at the end. So what I'm going to say, and I'm going to show you, is that verse 23 over here, it's a completely different line, that this line ends right here, and it begins right here. And we want to see that because where verse 23 gets put into the history is extremely important. So back to here. Verse 23 is a break in the passage. That's marking verse 22 as the end of the prophetic line that began in verse 16. Accompanied with the distinct ending of the line of verse 22 is the fact that verse 22 is a symbol of the same waymark represented in verse 16 and provides another witness that verses 16 to 22 represent a distinct prophetic line. Add to this that verses 15 and 16 are marking the transition from the Seleucid kingdom to the Roman power, and you see a break in continuity from the Seleucids in verse 15 unto the Romans in verse 16. And the line of verse 16 to verse 22 is clearly isolated as a singular prophetic line. Verse 16 introduces a new power than the previous passage, thus marking a transition of prophetic history that is also marked by verse 23. The line begins and ends with the symbol of the Sunday law, and the line ends in the 22nd verse of the 11th chapter. Smith and the Three Caesars. The fact that verse 16 represents the Sunday law, as does verse 22, demands the two verses be aligned upon each other. And what I'm saying here now, if you go back to this illustration, is if verse 20, not if, but verse 22 is the Sunday law, and verse 16 is the Sunday law. So I need to bring these two verses together. And right here, this is verse 16, but it's also verse 22. It'll also be verse 41. But the point I'm making here is that this history in here, this line of history from verse 16 to 22, it's going to be over here before verse 16. Whatever is in this history from verse 16 to 22, 22 is the Sunday law, it's the cross. So when we bring verse 22 together with verse 16, this history here is going to be here. So whatever the history is, up here in these verses 17, 18, 19, and 20, 21, whatever that history is, it's something that is going to be before 16. It's something that is going to be found in the history between Raphia and Panium. The Smith and the Three Caesars. The fact that verse 16 represents the Sunday law, as does verse 22, demands that the two verses be aligned upon each other. Uriah Smith comments on verse 23 and explains why it represents a history that began further back in the history of the previous verses. I'm not sure. I see a hand raised by Daniel in the Revelation, whoever that is, and that's okay. But why just keep your questions to the end, and I'll go back in rather than I have a bad habit of getting sidetracked with questions, and I'll get really off target on this article if I don't put it in place first. But please save them. I'm not threatened by them, and I'm not threatened by going back in afterwards. Uriah Smith comments on verse 23 and explains why it represents a history that began further back in the history of the previous verses, as opposed to representing a history that follows immediately after the cross of verse 22. He quotes verse 23 and says, "To him with whom the league here spoken of is made must be the same power which has been the subject of the prophecy from the 14th verse, and that this is the Roman power, is shown beyond controversy in fulfillment of the prophecy in three individuals, as already noted, who successively ruled over the Roman Empire, namely Julius, Augustus, and Tiberius Caesar. The first, on returning to the fort of his own land, stumbled and fell and was not found. The second was a raiser of taxes, and he reigned in the glory of his kingdom, died neither in anger nor battle, but peacefully in his own bed," verse 20. The third was a dissembler and one of the vilest of characters. He entered upon the kingdom peacefully, but both his reign and his life were ended by violence. And in his reign, the Prince of the Covenant, Jesus of Nazareth, was put to death on the cross, verses 21 and 22. Christ can never be broken or put to death again. Hence, in no other government or in no other time can we find a fulfillment of these events. Some attempt to apply these verses to Antiochus and make one of the Jewish high priests the Prince of the Covenant, though they are never called such. This is the same kind of reasoning which endeavors to make the reign of Antiochus a fulfillment of the Antiochus Epiphanes, a fulfillment of the little horn of Daniel 8, and it is offered for the same purposes, namely to break the chain of evidence by which it is shown that the Advent doctrine is the doctrine of the Bible and that Christ is now at the door. But the evidence cannot be overthrown, the chain cannot be broken. Having taken us down through the secular events of the empire to the end of the 70 weeks, the prophet in verse 23 takes us back to the time when the Romans became directly connected with the people of God by the Jewish League, BC 161. Other places, Uriah Smith will give another date, but most all of the pioneers actually put 158 as is represented on the 1843 Pioneer Chart. But I'm not worried about the dates. I'm just acknowledging that here Smith says 161. I like Smith's flow of events, but I'm not worried about the date at this point. But the way he describes this history is nice. From which point we're taken down in a direct line of events to the final triumph of the church in the setting up of God's everlasting kingdom. The Jews, being grievously oppressed by the Syrian kings, sent an embassy to Rome to solicit the aid of the Romans and join themselves in a league of amity and confederacy with them. The Romans listened to the request of the Jews and granted them a decree couched in the words. Now, when it says the Jews are being grievously oppressed by the Syrian kings, it's saying the Jews are being grievously oppressed by the Seleucid Empire, which is the empire of Antiochus, which in relation to Judea and the Jews is the northern king. Okay, at that point, the northern king that's oppressing them is the Seleucid kingdom, the Syrian kings. The decree of the Senate, and I'm only saying that because we're going to talk about the revolt of the Maccabees, and you need to understand the revolt of the Maccabees was against Syria, the kings, the Antiochus kings. Okay, you'll see why you need to understand that in a moment. The decree of the Senate concerning a league of assistance and friendship with the nation of the Jews. This is quoting the decree. It shall not be lawful for any that are subject to the Romans to make war with the nation of the Jews, nor to assist those that do, either by sending them corn or ships or money, if any attack be made upon the Jews. And it continues on. And then Uriah Smith says, after he finishes that part, says, and at this time the Romans were a small people and began to work deceitfully or with cunning, as the word signifies. And from this point they rose by a steady and rapid ascent to the height of power, which they afterward attain. Uriah Smith, 270, 271, Daniel and Revelation. Not only does the cross of verse 22 end in line with the symbol that is also at the beginning of the line, but the very next verse drops back into the history which preceded the cross to roughly 30 years after Panium and roughly 100 years before Rome conquered Jerusalem. The waymark of the League of the Jews that Smith here identifies as 161 BC is identified by other pioneers as 158 BC. The point I'm focusing on here is not so much the date, but the verses 16 to 22 represent a line of prophetic history, that the Sunday law is both the alpha and omega of the line. Then once the line of verse 16 unto 22 is set forth, verse 23 repeats and enlarges upon that very history. The prophetic line represented by verse 23 is the history of the Maccabees. And the history of the Maccabees is a perfect parallel to the history of the United States. Two dynasties. The Maccabees represent a rebellion against the Seleucid kingdom that began under the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. The rebellion began in that time. The rebellion was against the northern Seleucid kingdom, and it resulted in a victory that led to one of two Judean dynasties in the period that ultimately led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The first dynasty was the Hasmonean, and the second was the Herodian. The Herodian dynasty was the second Judean government after the deliverance from the northern Seleucid kingdom. It was directly connected to the Roman system, whereas the prior Hasmonean dynasty was essentially Jewish. The Hasmonean dynasty began in 141 BC, and in 37 BC, the Herodian dynasty began and lasted until AD 70 AD. The dynasties represent the government of Judea, the ancient and literal glorious land. The Maccabean revolt was from 167 to 160 BC. In 164 BC, the Maccabees drove Antiochus Epiphanes out of Jerusalem and cleansed and rededicated the temple after Antiochus had desecrated it. But it was not until 141 BC that the northern Seleucid power was fully vanquished and the Hasmonean dynasty began. The Herodian dynasty is the key to this line, for it was Herod the Great who called to execute the babies at the time of Jesus' birth, and his son was ruling when Jesus died. Herod the Great was the father, and he was the king over Judea, but his son was only a tetrarch, meaning he was a ruler over a fourth of the kingdom, like a governor rather than a king. That is why he lacked the authority which required him to connect with Pilate. Jesus' birth was the prophetic time of the end in the line of prophecy, in his line of prophecy, and his death was the Sunday law. The first Herod represents 1989, and the last Herod is the Sunday law. Herod unto Herod is the life of Christ. The line of the Maccabees begins with the victorious rebellion against a northern king who had enforced his Greek customs, culture, and political power, as well as the Greek religion, upon the Jews. The beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty represented 1798. If one dynasty began at the time of the end, as it was with the Herodian dynasty at the birth of Christ, then the other dynasty would be of prophetic necessity have the same beginning. The two dynasties both begin with the time of the end when we apply Christ's birth as the time of the end, but the foolish never see the unsealed light associated with the time of the end. Identifying Christ's birth as the key of bringing the line of the Maccabees into the present truth of the latter days is making Christ the very center of the passage, which is also evidence the application is valid. The line of the Maccabees illustrates the spiritual glorious land, and the illustration begins in the period where the citizens of the glorious land break away from the king of the north's political and religious domination. The Maccabean revolt that led to the Hasmonean dynasty represents 1776, and the revolt against the king of the north that was accomplished by the Maccabees represented the Revolutionary War. The 22 years of 1776 to 1798 represent the Maccabean rebellion that led to the Hasmonean dynasty at the time of the end in 1798, which continued until the Herodian dynasty began at the time of the end in 1989. The Herodian dynasty continued until the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. What is important to recognize in this line of history is twofold. It is an illustration of the ancient glorious land that typifies the modern glorious land, and it begins with a line of history that starts with verse 16, where Rome conquers the glorious land for the first time, thus identifying the primary theme of the line. The line of verse 16 unto verse 22 represents the glorious land, but it also represents two classes of worshipers that influence both dynastic governments. The Sadducees were less in numbers, but generally controlled the Jewish religious and political systems in both dynasties. The religious system was managed by a priesthood, and that priesthood was also influenced by both Sadducees and Pharisees. The Hasmonean and Herodian governments were both influenced by Pharisees and Sadducees. The dynasties represent the government of the United States from 1798 unto the Sunday Law. The Pharisees and Sadducees represent two parties of political persuasions that are distinguished by their stand upon the issue of slavery. The Democrats are pro-slavery and the Republicans are anti-slavery. And together they interact with the political apparatus of the constitutional government of the United States. That government is the earth beast of Revelation 13. And the external history of the earth beast is represented by its Republican horn. The internal history is represented by the Protestant horn. The horns are separated on the beast, for the beast is the constitution that separates the state horn from the church horn, but they move through history together. The Republican horn has two influences, either for or against slavery. The Protestant horn has two influences, either for the seventh day Sabbath day or the first day of the sun. Roughly 30 years after the Battle of Panium, the Maccabees mark the history of the United States as the sixth kingdom of Bible prophecy. Then, roughly a century later, verse 16 is fulfilled when Jerusalem is conquered, typifying the cross. By the time of the cross, the Maccabean history has been running for almost 200 years. Uriah Smith identifies the history represented by the League with the Jews in verse 23 is to be aligned to a starting point in history that occurred almost 200 years before the history of the cross in verse 22. The history of the cross in verse 22 must be aligned with verse 16, for verse 16 is also the Sunday Law. This means the line of the Maccabees, which is the history of the glorious land of Judah, begins well before verse 16, Sunday Law. When we understand that the Millerite history illustrates the history of the 144,000, we can align the time of the end for the Millerites in 1798 with the time of the end for the 144,000 in 1989. When we do that, we are overlaying the history of the first and second angels with the history of the third angel. 1798 and 1989 are the Alpha and Omega waymark of the history of verse 40 of Daniel 11. The first begins with the time of the end, which is easily proved to be 1798, and when correctly understood, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 fulfilled verse 40, and that fulfillment was the time of the end. The Maccabean revolt that led to the Hasmonean dynasty represents the 22 years from 1776 to 1798. And in 1798, the Hasmonean dynasty began, and the Herodian dynasty began in 1989. Verse 10 of Daniel 11 identifies 1989, and verse 16 is the Sunday law. The line of history within those two verses represents three battles: the demise of a southern king and the entrance of Rome into the prophetic message. It also contains the line of two dynasties that typify the change that occurs when the earth beast of Revelation 13, who had two horns like a lamb and spake as a dragon. Sequentially, the first Jewish dynasty is the lamb, and the second Roman dynasty is the dragon. The first dynasty was Jewish, the second was Roman. Whether Jewish or Roman, the earth beast had two horns. The Jewish dynasty represents the Protestant horn, and the Roman dynasty represents the Republican horn. Both horns are also divided into two. Whether political or religious, the relationship of the Sadducees and Pharisees provide the framework of the pro-slavery Democrats opposed to the anti-slavery Republicans, while also representing the twofold division of the foolish virgins in contrast with the wise virgins. The Pharisees, as foolish virgins, are purged at the first disappointment, and the Sadducees are purged at the second temple cleansing. Whether political or religious, both classes unite against the wise at the crisis at midnight. This being said, we began the article by raising the point that I'm applying verse 14 based upon its placement in the flow of verses in contradiction with the historical sequence represented by the verses. I employ that logic in agreement with the placement of verse 23. The placement of a waymark is to correspond to the history when it is fulfilled. The league that the Jews made with Rome during the Maccabean time period defined where the verse would be applied. The robbers of verse 14 who established the vision did so in 200 BC, the very year of the Battle of Panium, but the battle and the robbers are two different symbols. The robbers become part of the narrative not to establish a direct connection with the date of the Battle of Panium, but to identify the relation they made with the weakened 5-year-old ruler of Egypt that was about to be defeated by Antiochus. They did not want a disruption of the importation of Egyptian wheat to the Roman Empire. The prophetic relation of Rome with the vulnerable 5-year-old Egyptian king is the subject of the verse. That intercession is identifying the aftermath of the fallout that follows Putin's attempt to include the subjection of the Ukrainian church to the Russian church, as had formerly been before 1989. That attempt starts the progressive demise of the southern kingdom, and when Putin dies, as did Ptolemy, or simply exiled, as was Josiah and Napoleon, he is prophetically removed, and his kingdom is being handled by a series of less competent leaders, and then papal Rome intercedes to protect its interest, which is the Ukrainian church. In 1989, the Ukrainian church was a symbol of the king of the north sweeping away the Soviet Union, and Putin will seek to restore that former relationship of submission and receive leprosy on his forehead and begin a persecution against the religion that refused his demands. That persecution took place in his own nation, in the city of Alexandria. So churches within Russia that are influenced by Rome will become Putin's target and his ending. As Trump prepares for the Battle of Panium, his open relationship with the protector of the weakened Egyptian child king, the Roman power that in 200 BC protected the Egyptian king, will not protect the child king. She will help to end the child king, as she did in 1989. Rome as Egypt's protector in 200 BC represents Rome as Egypt's destroyer at the Battle of Panium. The Millerites did not see the three Roman powers. They only saw two, but their truth was truth just the same. The prophetic logic of Antiochus as a symbol allows us to apply verse 14 in a history that precedes verse 15, even if the history which initially fulfilled the verses placed both verse 14 and 15 in the year 200 BC. I'm claiming verse 16 is the soon coming Sunday law, and that verse 14 was 2025, and verse 15 is yet future. Is the yet future battle of Panium. Antiochus proves the three battles are one prophetic line, for he's at all three battles. But he also proves the claim I am asserting about the latter-day application of the verses when rightly divided with the line upon line methodology. Antiochus was at all three battles, and in the latter days he represents the papacy's proxy power in 1989, Reagan in the USA, 2014, Zelensky and the Ukraine, and then at the Battle of Panium, he is the same proxy power as 1989, for Jesus also represents the end with the beginning. Ronald Reagan is dead and buried. So the historical witness of Antiochus is accurate to the Millerite understanding, but subject to the rules which govern line upon line application. The last papal proxy power in the verses is Trump, even though historically Antiochus was at all three battles. In order to fulfill verse 13, Trump had to lose the second election, for in verse 13 he returns stronger than ever. Strong enough to take a bullet through the ear, which along with the right thumb and the right big toe is what was to be anointed with blood when the priests were anointed. I don't say much about this in this article, but we have a counterfeit temple being anointed in this history, just like we have a counterfeit parable of the 10 virgins. And the bullet in the ear was the anointing of Trump in his Golden Age movement. But back to the focus here. Reagan typified Trump, for Reagan is the first of the final 8 presidents from the time of the end of 1989. Lincoln typified Trump, for he was the first Republican president. Lincoln was assassinated by pro-slavery Democrats in alliance with Rome, and both Ronald Reagan and his popish counterpart, John Paul II, both survived assassination attempts. Trump was assassinated in 2020 with the stolen election in fulfillment of Revelation 11, verse 7. And then in 2024, he was resurrected in fulfillment of verse 11. When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them. And after 3 days and a half, the spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. Trump's resurrection was his return of verse 13, and it also provided a parallel of himself with Rome, for Rome is the 8th that is of the 7, and Trump is destined to set up an image of Rome. Revelation 17:11, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. Trump's second term makes him the 8th president since Reagan, and because he is also the 6th, Trump, in alignment with the papacy, is the 8th that is of the 7. 8 is the symbol of resurrection, which emphasizes that he, as an image of the papacy, needed to have a deadly wound that was healed in order to return. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Revelation 13:3. When the deadly wound is healed, the world wonders after the beast. And when Trump was resurrected as the 8th is of the 7 in 2024, he returned, and the whole world wondered after him. And after 3.5 days, the Spirit of the life of God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. Revelation 11:11 and 12. Trump returned in the election of 2024, and then in 2025, he and Pope Leo were both inaugurated. Jesus gave direct and fair warning to any who wish to see. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Matthew 24:15. Mark says it perhaps a little clearer. But when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them be in Judea flee to the mountains. Mark 13:14. The abomination of desolation is Rome in each of its three phases. Pagan, papal, and modern Rome is each a symbol of warning for the people of God. The warning is to be recognized when Rome is in a holy place or where it ought not to be. When Reagan, the first of 8 presidents, arranged a secret alliance with the Antichrist of Bible prophecy, it represented an open alliance with Rome by the 8th and last president since the time of the end in 1989. Omega symbols often reverse attributes of the alpha symbol. The inauguration of Pope Leo and Trump in 2025 is identifying an open relationship between the sea beast and the earth beast of Revelation 13. The reversal to an open alliance of Trump and Leo that was typified by the secret alliance of Reagan and John Paul II informs us that the support of the Egyptian child king that fulfilled verse 14 in 200 BC represents a lack of support in the latter days. 2025 establishes the external foundational vision of prophecy, for it lifts up Rome as the warning of Rome that is identified by Daniel with the symbolism of the abomination of desolation. The warning of the abomination of desolation takes place in advance of the destruction represented by the desolation. In the siege of Jerusalem under Cestius, the warning was represented by the banner of Rome's authority being placed within the sacred precincts of the sanctuary. Those who saw, understood, obeyed, and left the city and were protected when the siege was re-engaged. They saw the Roman warning sign. The Christians who separated from the compromised church of Pergamos and thereafter the church of Thyatira fled into the wilderness when they saw the man of sin sitting in the temple of God, telling himself that he was God. Those witnesses identify a warning of the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet in the latter days. We have repeatedly shown that 1888 was the siege of Cestius, and the conclusion of the Sunday law crisis is the siege of Titus. The Blair Bills of 1880s, and accompany it with the Sunday laws that were implemented in some southern states in 1888, was the warning of Cestius that also marked the dividing line on Sister White's Council on Country Living. Before the 1880s, her counsel was that in the future we would need to move to the country. But after the 1880s, country living was something that was to have already been accomplished. The warning sign of the Blair Bills, promoting the papal power's mark of authority, being discussed in the 1880s, typified the Patriot Act at 9/11, for the angel of Revelation 18 appeared in both those histories. 9/11 was the warning of Cestius, placing his authority in the holy place, where it should not be, for at 9/11, Roman law replaced English law. In the Pelosi trials of 2021, the Due Process Clause was repudiated and represents another footstep towards the siege of Titus, which ends at the soon-coming Sunday law in the United States. The siege is a period of time. 1888 speaks to the rebellion of the Protestant horn, and 9/11 speaks to the rebellion of the Republican horn. The inauguration of the Pope from the glorious land in the same year that the final president is also inaugurated represents the final warning of the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not before the Battle of Panium. The Battle of Panium leads directly to the Sunday Law and the Battle of Actium, which represents the third and final obstacle for imperial Rome before it ruled supremely for 360 years in fulfillment of Daniel 11:24. At the Sunday Law, the sixth and seventh kingdoms are both conquered by Rome, and modern Rome then reigns for a symbolic hour or 42 symbolic months. Whether it was the third obstacle at Actium for pagan Rome, or when the third obstacle represented by the Goths being driven out of the city of Rome in 538, when Rome overcomes the third obstacle, it rules supremely. Surely the Lord thy God will do nothing, but he revealed his servants, the prophets. And I want to deal with Amos in a moment to close this out, but I want to go back up here where it says, we've repeatedly shown that 1888 was the siege of Titus. The Blair Bills, what I was saying earlier, here's the point that I was mentioning at the beginning here today. There's curiosities or coincidences, however you want to label them, okay, about the place where I currently live that they're just real interesting. Okay, for instance, the road that I'm living on, it dead ends just a baseball throw almost on the road. To be a pretty good baseball player through. It's probably half a mile, quarter mile. It ends, but this road is called Amity Road. Amity meaning friendship. And if I take Amity Road and go 22 miles, I'm in Hot Springs. Okay, so that was always kind of a nice observation because Emmaus means hot springs. I'm living on the road to Emmaus. Okay, those kind of little nuances that you pick up along the way are just interesting. Not saying much about them. I remember one time when we first moved this property, we had to get to my house required at least it's probably 3 miles of dirt road to get out to my driveway, going the direction of Emmaus towards Hot Springs. But they've since paved it. And when they paved the road the very first time, within a day of it being paved, I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but the first time they put asphalt down, it's really slick and smooth and firm and nice and so on and so forth. But in front of my property, there's a real steep hill, and my granddaughter lived on the property at that time, and she had a horse that she was raising, Rusty, really nice horse, an Arabian. And I was getting ready to go overseas, which I did. I was on my way to the airport in Little Rock, and she had taken that horse out for a ride, and the road she always went on was a dirt road to get to where she rode the horses, but now it was paved with asphalt, and that whole horse slipped on that asphalt. And as I was driving by, I was watching my granddaughter in a ditch with a ambulance. Her leg was broken. She still has two, if I understand right, two metal rods in the one leg. I mean, she had bones coming out the skin and just in agony in the ditch. And if you're in the ditch in this part of Arkansas, then you're in there with the chiggers and the ticks. It was just horrible, and I left. Now, a little tidbit about that is that happened exactly in front of Clayton's house, and I'll tell you something about my son Clayton's house in a moment. But when my granddaughter was raising that horse, she bought that horse, and I don't know how you do it, but she traced the lineage of that particular horse. She knew where that horse came from way back when. She knew the man that it was purchased from. It's all in the documentation of that horse. That horse, its beginnings that could be traced, was traced back to one horse owner, and his name was William Miller. She had a descendant of William Miller's horse on this property. So those kind of little nuances, Road to Emmaus, William Miller's horse, always kind of blow your mind. Um, so when Clayton recently was reading A.T. Jones' Two Republics, and A.T. Jones is talking about the Sunday law crisis during the 1880s and the Blair Bills, and he's focusing on the Sunday laws that were coming into the states in the United States. And the only one he's focusing on is Arkansas, because Arkansas evidently was more severe because it included this agricultural element to it, that you could do gardening on Sunday as long as it was for yourself, but you couldn't do it if it was for commercial purposes. Well, the focus of the Arkansas Sunday law crisis turned out to take place in three counties of Arkansas, which are the counties that we happen to be surrounded with. It's Garland County, Malvern County, and Hot Springs County. And what it was is there was an Adventist, and he has a classic American name. If you know about the Hatfields and McCoys, this guy's name was McCoy, and I have no reason to think that he was a descendant of the McCoy clan that had this long, drawn-out war. But nevertheless, it's an easy way to remember his name. And he was an Adventist, and he went out and he was gathering potatoes on Sunday, and his neighbors come and labored with him, but watched him do it, turned him in, and that was the focus that A.T. Jones is making, is that one particular instance. A.T. Jones actually came and interviewed this McCoy about the situation, and the congregation was began by this Adventist McCoy, the church that is the descendant of that. I mean, this is 150 years ago. Okay, I can walk to that church. It's that close. And when I got fired from the ministry where I began doing public service, Hope International, it took a period of time to move on. And finally, we did move on. We moved on, and we lived in the state of Tennessee for 6 months, looking for country property. And before we moved from Hope International, there was a couple of people that moved out here to Arkansas, and together they bought 10 acres. And Brother Becker bought the 5 acres where my son's house is now, and Sister Lila Miller, she bought the other 5 acres. They split the 10 acres. But Lila was from Minnesota, and she was pretty old back at that time period. She was in her 70s, moving into her 80s. And her family in Minnesota told her that she needed to move back to Minnesota, where if she started having health problems, they would be around to help her. So that was right the time that we were looking for land. So we connected with Lila Miller because I knew her from Hope International. She'd been supporting the message, and I knew that she was looking to move back. So we made an agreement. The only time that my wife and I went into debt, other than I did it once for a tractor after that, but for decades, we just never went into debt. If we didn't have the money to buy something outright, we did. But we did with buying this particular property from Lila, but we did it. It's kind of cool because we incorporated into the papers for buying it that if there was a Sunday law before I paid off her property, that the property was mine free and clear. There wasn't going to be any seizing of her property that allowed the government to seize our property, but we paid it off. It was just part of the story. But what we realized is that the 10 acres they bought, Becker and Miller here, that we ended up purchasing, it was in the middle of a piece of land by a family here, a family that had years and years ago owned a bunch of property, okay, one big hunk of property. And over the years, they've sold off this property, but we happened to, the 10 acres that Becker and Miller bought was 10 acres that one of the sisters from this family cut off of her property to sell, but it becomes the border between one sister and another sister. And those two sisters are my neighbors now. Okay. And that's the property that we're in. And those two sisters are the descendants of the people that turned in the McCoy Adventists in the Sunday law crisis. And we're living in the very heart, the very dead center of that history that A.T. Jones was speaking at. And at that time period, we're living in a forest now. It wasn't a forest. They're grown cotton. They even had slaves during that time period before the Civil War in this history. And in this neck of the woods out here, there was a train that came through here. And the only place the train stopped was where my granddaughter fell off of William Miller's horse and shattered her leg right in front of my son's house. And that train would stop for people to get off there to go hunting. Somehow, some way, I ended up living in a house that was raised by Sister Lila. She was the first person to live in this house, my wife and I the second. Her last name was Miller. And this property is dead center in the heart geographically of the Sunday law crisis of the 1880s, as testified to by a book that A.T. Jones wrote that's over 100 years old. Go figure. Whether it was the third obstacle at Actium for pagan Rome, or when the third obstacle represented by the Goths being driven out of the city of Rome in 538, when Rome overcomes the third obstacle, it rules supremely. Surely the Lord thy God will do nothing, but he revealeth his servants unto his servants, his secret unto his servants, the prophets. Amos 3:7. I'm sorry. The Lord will surely give the final manifestation of the warning sign that is represented as the abomination in the book of Daniel before the desolation arrives. He never changes. That warning sign is the open alliance, in contrast with Reagan's secret alliance being represented in 2025. The Lord will not bring punishment without first giving warning. And Amos is very direct what this revelation of a secret to his servants is. Hear this word that the Lord has spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family which I brought up from the land of Egypt, saying, You only have I all the families of the earth. You only have I known of all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. Amos 3:1 and 2. Amos is addressing the last generation of God's chosen covenant people who are to be punished in alignment with the 25 men who bow down to the sun in Ezekiel 8. Amos is presenting the Laodicean message, which is the third angel's message during the blotting out of sin in the time of the judgment of the living. Amos' warning is based upon a unification of two parties. Can two walk together except they be agreed? Will a lion roar in the forest when he hath no prey? Will a young lion cry out of his den if he hath taken nothing? Can a bird fall into a snare upon the earth where no gin is for him? Shall one take up a snare from the earth and have taken nothing at all? Shall a trumpet be blown in the city and the people not be afraid? Shall there be evil in the city and the Lord hath not done it? Amos 3:3-6. The warning of two walking together as one is set within the context of a snare catching a bird from the earth. Birds are symbols of religious bodies, and the papacy is the cage of every unclean and hateful bird in Revelation. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and become the habitation of devils, the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk from the wine of their wrath of fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. A bird in the cage is a captured bird. And when a nation commits fornication with the whore of Rome, it becomes a captured bird. And that bird is lifted up above, and the bird that is lifted up above them all is the power who is placed in Shinar, according to Zechariah. It is the bird that received the deadly wound in 1798, or as Zechariah states, had a lead cover placed over its basket, but was thereafter lifted up by the birds of spiritualism and apostate Protestantism. Then the angel that talked with me went forth and said unto me, Lift up now thine eyes and see what is that goeth forth. And I said, What is it? And he said, This is an ephah, a basket that goeth forth. He said, Moreover, this is their resemblance throughout all the earth. And behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead, and this woman is the woman that setteth in the midst of the basket of the ephah. And he said, This is wickedness. And that wicked in Second Thessalonian is the papacy. This is wickedness. And he cast it into the midst of the basket, the ephah, and he cast a weight of lead upon the mouth thereof. Delivered the deadly wound in 1798. Then I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, there came out two women. The wind was in their wings. A woman is a church. They're birds, they have wings, for they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between heaven and earth. Then said I to the angel that talked with me, Whether do these bear the ephah? And he said unto me, To build it an house in the land of Shinar in Babylon, and it shall be established and set there upon her own base. Amos' snare catches the bird from the earth, for it represents the alliance that precedes the soon coming Sunday law, where the bird is captured. And according to Amos, the alliance is a rebuke to Laodicean Adventism. For there will be a warning trumpet blown in the city, which they will refuse to hear. Shall a trumpet be blown in the city, and the people not be afraid? Shall there be evil in the city, and the Lord hath not done it? Surely the Lord thy God will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret unto his servants the prophets. The lion hath roared. Who will not fear? The Lord God hath spoken. Who can but prophesy? The lion who roars is the lion of the tribe of Judah, who represents Christ when he unseals and seals his prophetic word. The open alliance of 2025 is the siege of Cestius, and the symbol of the robbers of thy people is established when you see two walking together that should never coexist. Rome allied and aligned with Protestants is an oxymoron, for to be a Protestant means to protest against Rome. We will continue these things in the next article. God's word has given warning of the impending danger. Let this be unheeded, and the Protestant world will learn what the purposes of Rome really are only when it's too late to escape the snare. There's a world lying in wickedness, but some will have delayed to obtain the oil for replenishing their lamps, and too late they will find that character, which is represented by the oil, is not transferable. As I viewed poor souls dying for want of present truth, and some who professed to believe the truth were letting them die by withholding the necessary means to carry forward the work of God, the sight was too painful, and I begged the angel to remove it from me. I saw that when the cause of God called for some of their property, like the young man who came to Jesus, they went away sorrowful, and that soon the overflowing scourge would pass over and sweep their possessions all away. And then it would be too late to sacrifice earthly goods. Judas saw that his entreaties were in vain, and he rushed from the hall, exclaiming, Too late, it's too late. He felt that he could not live to see Jesus crucified, and in despair went out and hanged himself. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, we're living in tremendous times. prophecy is fulfilling fast. Your people are asleep. The world's being shaken in so many different ways. And you've given us the privilege of understanding these things and presenting these things, and we thank you for that. But we need more. We need your Holy Spirit to bring not only our understanding, but our experience into agreement with these times. And we ask that you will accomplish that for us as we continue to follow you wherever you lead us. And we thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.